Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive right into the fascinating science, history, and lived experience of human sexuality. We'll be pulling from decades of psychological, biological, and sociological research to get a better handle on who we are and exactly how we connect with one another. Whether you're super familiar with this topic or just starting to look into it, the data we're unpacking today is absolutely eye-opening. Let's get started.
To kick things off, let's flip the script for a second with a pretty provocative question. Think about it. When did you first decide you were straight? It's kind of jarring, right? This is actually a question frequently given to straight people in psychological questionnaires to point out a really fundamental truth. You see, folks who identify as straight are rarely, if ever, asked if their orientation was a choice. Saying it out loud makes us realize that sexual orientation is a profound reality of who you are as a person, not just some conscious choice you make on a whim. In this explainer, we're going to cover defining the spectrum, realities and relationships, the search for origins, the coming out process, and finally, prejudice and progress.
All right, Section 1, defining the spectrum. How do scientists and psychologists actually categorize human sexual orientation? Well, our modern understanding really kicked off with Alfred Kinsey's famous sexual orientation rating scale. Kinsey established through some pretty extensive research that human sexuality isn't just this strict black and white binary. Instead, it exists on a continuum. It goes from a 0, meaning exclusively heterosexual, all the way up to a 6, which is exclusively homosexual. And what Kinsey found is that very few people are actually absolute 0s or absolute 6s. Most of us fall somewhere along this beautifully complex spectrum. Since then, our vocabulary has expanded way beyond Kinsey's original scale. Today, terminology is continually evolving to reflect lived realities. We recognize diverse identities like bisexuality, attraction to more than one gender, as well as pansexuality, which is an emotional and sexual attraction to people regardless of their gender identity. And we also recognize asexuality, where someone experiences little to no desire for sexual activity. It's a rich, multifaceted landscape for sure. Moving right along to Section 2, realities and relationships. Let's examine the actual interpersonal dynamics of same-sex couples and, separate fact from fiction.
So, you've very likely heard this persistent myth, the idea that same-sex relationships are somehow inherently more prone to dysfunction or unhappiness compared to straight relationships. But, as we love to do in this explainer, we're going to look at the actual evidence. And guess what? The sociological data tells a completely different story. In reality, overall relationship satisfaction and quality are completely identical regardless of the gender makeup of the couple. But it actually gets even more fascinating than that. Research shows that gay and lesbian couples tend to be more upbeat about their relationships. When conflicts inevitably pop up, they use more humor, they withdraw less from the argument, and they exhibit less hostility and controlling behavior overall. The data literally shows incredibly healthy interpersonal dynamics.
Okay, Section 3, the search for origins. Let's look into the really intense scientific debate over the biological and environmental roots of sexual orientation. What actually makes us who we are?
Let's start with the brain. Back in 1991, a researcher named Simon LeVay published some truly groundbreaking findings. He discovered these minute but highly consistent and measurable differences in a specific area of the brain, the third interstitial nucleus, when comparing straight men and gay men. Now, while this doesn't strictly prove that brain structure alone causes sexual orientation, it strongly hints at a deep biological foundation that's present from a very early stage of development.
Here's another wild biological marker, the index to ring finger ratio. I know, it sounds surprising, right? But researchers actually use this ratio as a marker for a fetus's exposure to male hormones while still in the womb. Many scientists believe that variations in this hormonal environment during pregnancy might actually influence a person's eventual adult sexual orientation.
And when we look at twin studies, the genetic link becomes even clearer. Studies repeatedly show that if one identical twin is gay or lesbian, there's around a 50% chance that the other twin shares that exact same orientation. When you compare that to fraternal twins or adopted siblings, the rate drops significantly. This widespread scientific support shows us that genes play a really important, even if not exclusive role in who we're attracted to. But what about the environment? While psychologist Daryl Bem attempts to merge nature and nurture through this fascinating concept called the exotic becomes erotic, or EBE theory. Bem suggests that we aren't necessarily born with a specific orientation, but rather with biological temperaments.
These temperaments make some children feel different from certain groups of peers. This childhood feeling of difference, seeing the other group as exotic, creates an emotional arousal that, once puberty hits, eventually translates into adult erotic attraction. Really interesting way to look at it.
Shifting gears to Section 4, the coming out process. Let's look at the deeply personal, entirely unique, and often really challenging journey of navigating identity.
Because coming out, it isn't just a single dramatic moment like you see in the movies. It's actually a complex, multi-stage process. It often starts with identity confusion, feeling unsure about your orientation. Then it moves to identity assumption, which is acknowledging it to yourself. That's followed by identity acceptance, becoming comfortable with it. And finally, you reach identity synthesis and commitment, where a person proudly and openly integrates their orientation into their everyday life, totally without shame.
However, getting through those stages is uniquely difficult because of societal hostility. It's devastating, but gay, lesbian, and bisexual teens consider, plan, and attempt suicide at drastically higher rates than their straight peers. Navigating personal identity development is hard enough when you're a teenager, but doing it in an environment that might be hostile or rejecting, it makes the process genuinely dangerous. But there is a profound light at the end of this tunnel. Folks who successfully reach that final stage of identity synthesis report these incredible feelings of liberation and relief. They literally describe it as the lifting of an immense weight off their shoulders. And wonderfully, researchers find that these positive emotions virtually always end up feeling stronger than the fear they had to face along the way. Which brings us to Section 5, Prejudice and Progress. We've looked at the individual. Now let's zoom out to see the broader societal battlegrounds, where the fight for equality is still being waged.
The modern gay rights movement has evolved at just a breakneck pace over a few short decades. It was really catalyzed in 1969 when patrons at the Stonewall Inn in New York fought back against police raids. From there, the community had to navigate the devastating HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. But through absolutely relentless advocacy, monumental constitutional victories were achieved, like the Supreme Court striking down sodomy laws in 2003 and the landmark 2015 decision that legalized same-sex marriage across the entire United States.
Yet when we look at the current landscape, progress is, well, it's incredibly fragmented. Depending on the state, in about half of the country, there are still no explicit laws protecting people from being fired from their jobs or denied housing simply because of who they love. And sadly, the physical dangers persist too. Violence based on sexual orientation remains one of the most common categories of hate crimes reported by the FBI. These crimes are stark reminders of the extreme fear and homophobia that still exist in parts of our society today. Interestingly, there's a psychological twist to this. Research into violent attackers often uncovers a defense mechanism called reaction formation. What this means is that perpetrators sometimes act out with aggressive, gruesome violence specifically to deny or suppress their own hidden same-sex desires. The violence literally acts as a defense mechanism against tendencies they deeply fear within themselves. It's a tragic cycle. So we have covered a massive amount of ground today, right? From brain structures and genetics to Supreme Court rulings and the deeply personal journey of coming out. But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on. While the science behind human sexuality is undeniably fascinating and helps validate lived experiences, do the exact origins of sexual orientation really matter as much as non-judgmental human acceptance? Perhaps our greatest focus, above all the data, should simply be on fostering empathy, understanding, and equal rights for absolutely everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.